It began like so many HOA nightmares do, quietly, almost politely, with a letter. The white envelope sat on the edge of Mark Ellison's porch one Tuesday morning, tucked neatly beneath the welcome mat as though it were a friendly reminder instead of a summons. Inside, the HOA's emblem glared in bold print above a short paragraph informing him that his dog, a 2-year-old golden retriever named Cooper, had been the subject of multiple noise complaints. A $75 fine was attached. Mark wasn't surprised. Cooper had a loud bark, sure, but he barked only when squirrels darted across the fence or when the mail truck clattered down the street. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have drawn so much attention. The real problem wasn't the barking. It was the HOA board president, Judith Pierce. Judith was the kind of neighbor who measured the color of grass blades and reported teenagers for skateboarding too close to driveways. She lived 2 houses down and ruled the community with the precision of a general. Her lawn was flawless, her house repainted every spring, and her hatred for disturbances legendary. Mark had moved into Willow Creek Estates hoping for quiet suburban peace, not realizing peace in Judith's domain came only on her terms. The first fine felt like a warning shot. Mark paid it, reluctantly, and assumed it would end there. But the next letter arrived barely a week later, then another, and another. Each complaint grew more exaggerated. Excessive barking during quiet hours. Disturbance of community harmony. Failure to maintain control of pet. By the 4th letter, the fines had reached over $400. Mark felt both anger and disbelief. He worked long shifts as a paramedic and knew Cooper spent most of the day sleeping near the window. The idea that his dog was terrorizing the neighborhood was absurd. He tried to reason through official channels, emails, calls, written, and appeals, but the HOA board dismissed every request for reconsideration. They claimed to have witness statements and video evidence, though none was ever shown. The harassment grew until Mark began to feel like an outsider in his own home. The turning point came one Saturday morning when he stepped outside to find Judith standing in front of his yard, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from her wrist. She was documenting fence height inconsistencies and excessive noise potential. Cooper sat quietly on the porch beside him, tail thumping, completely oblivious to the tension brewing. That day, Mark realized the fight wasn't just about noise. It was about control. Judith wanted him to bend, to submit to the image she had crafted of a perfect neighborhood. And he, a man with a dog who barked at passing cars, was a blemish on that image. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. Mark's mailbox filled with warnings. Anonymous notes appeared under his door. Some people don't belong here. If you can't handle the rules, maybe you should move. Even his trash cans were mysteriously knocked over at night. Meanwhile, Cooper sensed his owner's frustration. The once carefree retriever grew more alert, pacing by the windows as if guarding against unseen threats. Late at night, he would growl softly, staring into the darkness beyond the fence. It was around this time that Mark noticed something strange. Judith's husband, a quiet man rarely seen outside, had begun leaving their garage light on late into the night. Sometimes, shadows moved behind the half-closed door, boxes shifting, a faint metallic sound echoing across the street. Once, Mark caught a glimpse of what looked like large containers being rolled inside. It wasn't his business, he told himself. Not yet. But as the weeks went by, more neighbors began whispering. Packages delivered at odd hour, as unmarked vans parked near Judith's driveway. Strange smells drifting through the cul-de-sac on humid nights. And through it all, Judith's crusade against Mark continued with almost fanatical. Then came the final notice, a formal letter threatening legal action and the removal of Cooper if behavioral issues persisted. The HOA cited numerous complaints and referenced potential violation of community safety standards. Mark sat at his kitchen table that evening, letter in hand, feeling cornered. His savings were running low after paying fines, and moving wasn't an option. He looked down at Cooper, lying peacefully by his feet, unaware that his very existence had become a neighborhood scandal. But as night fell and the quiet hum of the street returned, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was stirring beyond the HOA's petty vendetta. Cooper's ears perked up suddenly, tail stiff, gaze fixed on the glowing garage across the street. Whatever Judith was hiding, it wasn't just HOA paperwork, and in a few days, Cooper would be the one to uncover it, changing everything about Willow Creek Estates forever. The night air in Willow Creek Estates had always been calm, an eerie sort of calm that seemed almost forced, like the silence in a museum. But after weeks of hostility from the HOA, Mark had stopped trusting the stillness. He'd begun leaving his porch light on, a small act of defiance and reassurance, though it didn't do much to quiet his unease. Cooper, on the other hand, had become restless. His once lazy naps were replaced with long vigils by the front window. Some nights he'd growl, low and uncertain, until Mark coaxed him back to his bed. But that night, 3 days after the final HOA letter, was different. It began just after midnight. The sky was clouded, moonlight filtering weakly through the trees. Mark sat at his desk, half asleep over paperwork, when Cooper's sharp bark jolted him awake. It wasn't the casual bark of curiosity. It was urgent, almost alarmed. Mark rose and followed his dog to the window. Across the street, Judith's garage. Each door was open halfway, the inside dimly lit by a single hanging bulb. 2 shadowy figures moved inside, one tall, one shorter, heaving what looked like metal canisters from the back of a pickup truck. Their movements were quick, tense, and deliberate. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of it. The neighborhood had strict rules about late-night work, noise ordinances, tool restrictions, even driveway usage. But these men weren't tinkering or fixing anything. They were unloading something heavy, cylindrical, and unmarked. Cooper growled again, louder this time, pressing against the window as if urging Mark to act. Before he could decide what to do, the garage door began to close slowly. The figures vanished behind it, and silence returned. The next morning, Judith was outside early, pruning her flowers as though nothing had happened. Her movements were precise, her expression unreadable. The garage door stayed tightly shut. Mark watched from across the street, debating whether to confront her or mind his own business. After all, the HOA already viewed him as a nuisance. The last thing he needed was another confrontation. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. That evening, he walked Cooper past her house, pretending it was just another stroll. As they passed the driveway, Cooper stopped abruptly, nose twitching, ears alert. A faint chemical odor hung in the air, sharp, bitter, like something industrial. Mark frowned, tugging gently on the leash, but Cooper wouldn't budge. He growled softly, the sound low and uneasy. Mark didn't linger. He turned back toward his house, but that smell, strange and out of place, lingered in his mind long after he got home. By the end of the week, the tension in Willow Creek had thickened. 2 neighbors whispered about construction work near Judith's property, while others claimed to hear loud bangs late at night. The HOA dismissed every concern, labeling them as rumors. Mark began to suspect the board wasn't just ignoring the situation. They were protecting her. Then one evening, as Mark was getting ready for bed, Cooper started barking again, this time facing the backyard. The hair on his neck stood straight. Mark turned off the lights and looked out the back window. A dim orange glow shimmered faintly through the trees behind Judith's home. It wasn't the soft warmth of a porch light. It flickered, unstable, like something burning. Moments later, there was a loud crack, followed by a deep metallic thud. Cooper barked furiously now, pulling at the door. Mark grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, his heart pounding. The smell hit him immediately, smoke, oil, and something acrid. He followed Cooper toward the fence line, where he could see the glow more clearly. Flames licked the edge of Judith's property, rising behind the garage. Someone was shouting faintly, muffled by the thick night air. Without thinking, Mark vaulted the fence, Cooper close behind. The scene on the other side was chaos. One of the metal canisters had ruptured, leaking a viscous, burning liquid across the gravel. The fire was spreading fast toward the house. Judith stood frozen by the doorway, paralyzed by shock. Mark rushed forward, grabbing a nearby hose, but the pressure was weak, too weak to make a difference. He shouted for her to move back, but she just stood there, hands trembling. That's when Cooper sprinted ahead, barking wildly, circling the yard. He darted toward the back gate, herding Judith away from the flames like a sheepdog. His loud, frantic barks snapped her out of her daze, forcing her to move. Mark pulled her toward the street, coughing from the smoke. The neighbors began emerging from their homes, confusion spreading as the fire grew brighter. Cooper ran back toward the house, barking into the smoke, refusing to leave. Mark shouted for him, but Cooper didn't return. The heat was intense now, the air thick and unbreathable. Then, through the haze, Mark saw him dragging something, a long black object that glimmered with metal. It was one of the canisters, rolling it away from the main blaze out into the open yard where it couldn't ignite anything else. When Cooper finally stumbled back toward Mark, his fur was streaked with ash, his chest heaving. But the worst was over. Sirens wailed in the distance as the fire department arrived. By dawn, the fire was contained. The garage was destroyed, but the house, along with several nearby homes, had been saved from complete ruin. The neighborhood gathered in stunned silence as firefighters cordoned off the area. They found at least a dozen more metal containers, all unmarked, filled with illegal, flammable chemicals. No one knew what Judith's husband had been storing or why, but the entire block had nearly gone up in flames. Judith sat on the curb, eyes red, face pale, watching as investigators swarmed her property. She didn't look at Mark or Cooper, but everyone else did. The same neighbors who once complained about noise now stood in quiet awe of the dog who'd saved them. Mark knelt beside Cooper, running his hand through the soot-streaked fur. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like relief. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The HOA would find a way to twist the story, to protect themselves, to deny the truth. And they would soon learn that Cooper's heroism had only just begun to unravel everything they'd tried to hide. By the following morning, the tranquility of Willow Creek Estates was gone. The street buzzed with emergency vehicles, reporters, and shaken residents clutching coffee mugs as they watched firefighters finish their inspection. The blackened shell of Judith's garage stood as a grim reminder of how close the neighborhood had come to disaster. But as the smoke cleared, something else began to emerge. A narrative. And not the truth. Mark Ticed at first when he overheard two HOA board members speaking quietly near the end of the cul-de-sac. They weren't discussing the chemicals or Judith's husband's suspicious activity. Instead, they focused on damage control. The words insurance, liability, and public perception kept surfacing in their hushed tones. By noon, the HOA had released an official statement. It was pinned to every community bulletin board and emailed to residents. The message was short, polished, and utterly infuriating. It referred to the blaze as an unfortunate accident involving a homeowner's storage materials, praised the swift response of the HOA and emergency services, and made no mention whatsoever of Cooper or of Mark. The neighborhood's savior, the dog who had risked his life, wasn't even acknowledged. Instead, the letter subtly implied that a resident's pet had agitated the situation with excessive barking, possibly contributing to the chaos before responders arrived. Mark stared at the email on his phone, disbelief hardening into anger. It wasn't just that they ignored the truth, they were rewriting it. Later that afternoon, as investigators wrapped up their work, a county officer confirmed Mark's suspicions. The containers in Judith's garage had contained unregistered cleaning solvents and paint thinners, stacked in violation of safety codes. If Cooper hadn't barked and alerted Mark when he did, several homes could have exploded before firefighters ever arrived. But the HOA had no interest in facts. They were in survival mode. Judith's reputation, and by extension the board's image, were all that mattered. For the next 2 days, HOA representatives circulated the neighborhood, quietly discouraging residents from spreading rumors. They called it community unity, but everyone understood what it really meant: silence. Mark tried to keep to himself, focusing on caring for Cooper. The dog was recovering slowly. His paws were tender from the heat, and patches of his fur were still singed. But he wagged his tail like nothing had happened. Every time Mark looked at him, pride and resentment tangled together inside him. Cooper had saved lives, and the people who once fined them for noise disturbances were pretending none of it had happened. The tension came to a head at the next HOA emergency meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, packed tighter than it had ever been before. Residents filled every seat, their whispers cutting through the air like dry leaves. Judith sat near the front, her posture rigid, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. She looked smaller somehow, her usual air of command gone. The meeting began with the vice president, a thin man named Carl, reading a pre-written statement about safety improvements and community restoration. Then came the twist: Judith's resignation for personal reasons. It was the HOA's way of containing the damage. Remove the face of the scandal, but preserve the system that enabled it. But before they could adjourn, a hand rose from the back. It was Mrs. Daniels, one of the oldest residents and the woman whose home had been closest to the fire. In a trembling voice, she thanked Mark and Cooper for their courage, recounting how the dog had dragged one of the burning containers away. The room grew quiet, heads turned toward Mark. The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly unprepared for this interruption. Mark said nothing, but the silence spoke for him. Every neighbor present could see the contrast between the polished lies of the HOA and the truth standing right in front of them. The next day, the story broke online. Someone, no one ever admitted who, had sent photos and details of the fire to a local news outlet. The headline read, "Hero Dog Saves Suburban Neighborhood from Fire. HOA Attempts to Silence Owner." Within hours, the article exploded across social media. Neighbors began sharing it, tagging the HOA's official page. The once feared association found itself under a flood of public outrage. People across town demanded accountability. Mark's inbox filled with messages, support from strangers, requests for interviews, and even offers from local pet organizations to honor Cooper. It was overwhelming, but also vindicating. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. The HOA was no longer the one dictating the story, but the victory was short-lived. 3 days later, Mark received another letter. The same emblem, the same cold language. This time, the fine wasn't about noise, it was about unauthorized media communication on behalf of the community. The HOA accused him of violating public representation policies, claiming he had damaged the neighborhood's reputation by speaking to reporters. They demanded $500 and a written apology. It was laughable and terrifying. Even after everything, they were still coming after him. That night, as Mark sat on the porch with Cooper lying beside him, the street was eerily quiet. But it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful. The neighbors who once ignored him now waved when they passed. They whispered encouragement. The HOA's grip was slipping, and everyone could feel it. Yet something darker loomed beneath the surface. Because even though Judith had resigned, her husband hadn't left town. Mark had seen him earlier that evening, standing in his driveway watching silently as the last of the investigators drove away. His expression was blank, but his eyes lingered too long on Mark's house. The fire might have exposed one secret, but it hadn't burned them all. And as Cooper lifted his head, ears twitching at some sound in the distance, Mark realized their fight with the HOA, and whoever else had been involved, was far from over. In the weeks following the fire, Willow Creek Estates transformed into a neighborhood divided. On one side stood those who admired Mark and his dog, grateful for the lives they had saved. On the other, the remnants of the HOA board, now offensive, bitter, and desperate to regain control of their fractured community. The fine for unauthorized media communication became the latest spark in a growing blaze of resentment. Mark refused to pay it. Instead, he filed a complaint with the county housing department, attaching the HOA's letters, fines, and evidence of harassment. He had finally decided to fight back with the same persistence they had used to wear him down. But retaliation came swiftly. Within days, an inspector arrived unannounced, citing Mark for property maintenance violations. The report listed exaggerated issues: untrimmed shrubs, visible debris near the side gate, and an unapproved modification to backyard fencing. It was absurd. Every item trivial, every accusation clearly retaliatory. Still, the HOA now had leverage. Mark spent the next few evenings documenting everything: photos, timestamps, every letter they sent. Cooper followed him everywhere, sensing his tension, rarely leaving his side. But as the paperwork piled up, so did the unease. Strange things began happening again. One morning, Mark's garbage cans were overturned, their contents scattered across the driveway. A week later, a dead bird was left on his porch. Then came the night when he found deep scratches on his truck door, as if made deliberately with a key. There were no witnesses, no cameras, but everyone knew who was behind it. The HOA no longer bothered hiding their hostility. The vice president, Carl, began walking past Mark's property more frequently, clipboard in hand, pretending to take routine notes. Whenever Cooper barked, he would smirk. The petty intimidation was constant, almost ritualistic. But Mark refused to back down. He began compiling a digital file of every encounter, an archive that grew thicker with each passing day. And while he worked, Cooper stood guard. The once playful retriever had become a vigilant protector, alert to every sound, every movement. Then, one night the situation escalated beyond intimidation. It was just past midnight when Mark heard a dull thud outside, something heavy falling against his fence. Cooper was up instantly, barking furiously, the sound sharp and relentless. Mark grabbed his flashlight and rushed out the back door. The beam of light swept across the yard and froze on a figure crouched by the fence, half hidden in the shadows. For a second, Mark thought it was an animal. Then the man stood up. It was Judith's husband. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared across the yard with a look that made Mark's blood run cold. Cooper lunged forward, barking louder than ever, his growl echoing through the quiet night. The man backed away slowly, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fence line. Mark called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. The officers took a statement and promised to increase patrols, but their tone suggested they viewed it as a neighborhood dispute, not a threat. The next morning, a new letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was a notice of intent to place a lien on Mark's property for unpaid dues and accumulated penalties. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The HOA had turned the firestorm of public sympathy into a bureaucratic weapon. Word spread fast. Neighbors whispered about it during morning walks, angered by the board's behavior. Some residents openly sided with Mark, forming a small group that began questioning how the HOA was spending community funds. Others remained silent, too afraid of being targeted next. Meanwhile, Judith's husband, vanished. His car sat unused for days, the house dark at night. Some said he had left town. Others claimed he was still there, hiding. But one thing was clear. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a breaking point. Then came the night everything changed again. It started with rain. A heavy storm rolled through the area, lightning splitting the sky as thunder rolled over the rooftops. Power flickered and the streets emptied. Mark sat near the window, watching the downpour, when Cooper stiffened suddenly. His ears twitched, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Before Mark could react, a flash of light illuminated the street, and he saw movement near the HOA office at the end of the block. Two figures stood outside the building, struggling with something near the utility panel. Then, sparks erupted. Within moments, the power went out completely. The neighborhood plunged into darkness. Cooper barked frantically, pacing near the door. Mark grabbed his flashlight again and stepped onto the porch. Through the rain, he could see one of the figures running away from the HOA office. The other lingered, fumbling with what looked like a gasoline canister. The realization hit Mark instantly. They were trying to set fire to the office. Maybe to destroy records. Maybe to erase evidence. He shouted for help, but his voice was lost in the storm. Without hesitation, Cooper bolted ahead, barking wildly as he ran straight toward the office. Mark followed, slipping on the wet pavement, heart pounding. By the time he reached the building, Cooper was already at the door, scratching furiously. The second figure was gone, but the smell of gasoline filled the air. Mark kicked the canister aside just as a flicker of flame tried to catch. It sputtered out in the rain, dying before it could ignite. The police arrived minutes later. Neighbors had called after hearing the commotion. Officers found evidence of tampering and traces of fuel, confirming Mark's suspicions. The attempted arson was real. As the crowd gathered again under umbrellas and porch lights, one thing became undeniable: the pattern. First the garage fire, now the HOA office. Someone was trying to cover up something bigger. And as Mark stood there, soaked and shaking, Cooper sitting loyally at his side, he realized the full scale of what they were up against. This wasn't just petty retaliation. It was desperation. Someone within the HOA had something to hide, and they were willing to destroy everything to keep it buried. But what they hadn't counted on was a man who refused to be silenced, and a dog who always sensed danger before anyone else did. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The morning after the storm, Willow Creek Estates no longer felt like a quiet suburban neighborhood. It felt like a battlefield. Yellow police tape surrounded the HOA office, its doors scorched but intact. The attempted arson had failed, but the damage was symbolic. The board's power, once absolute, was unraveling. Yet for Mark, the danger had only deepened. He could feel it every time he stepped outside, every time Cooper's ears twitched at unseen movements beyond the fences. The police investigation was slow. They questioned residents, collected fingerprints, and made vague promises of increased patrols, but nothing concrete happened. The HOA board stayed silent, offering no explanation, no acknowledgement of the attack. It was as though they wanted the entire incident buried before anyone could connect it to them. But the neighborhood wasn't staying quiet anymore. In the days that followed, whispers turned into open defiance. Residents began attending meetings not to listen, but to challenge. They demanded transparency about finances, about Judith's resignation, about the unexplained storage of illegal chemicals in her garage. For the first time, the board members were on the defensive. Carl, the vice president, struggled to maintain control. His speeches were short, his tone clipped. When questioned about the attempted arson, he brushed it off as vandalism by outsiders. But no one believed him. Meanwhile, Mark continued gathering evidence. He built a folder of photos, letters, and timelines, everything from the first noise complaint to the fire, the fines, the threats, and now the attack on the HOA office. The deeper he looked, the more connected ions emerged. Several HOA payments were unaccounted for in public records. The board had approved maintenance expenses that didn't match any known projects. It all pointed to one thing: money laundering or fraud. And Judith's husband, now missing, was likely involved. Mark debated going public again, but he knew what that would invite. The HOA had already fined and harassed him for speaking out once. Still, keeping quiet felt worse. Every night he sat on his porch, the weight of responsibility pressing heavier on him. Cooper remained vigilant, sleeping lightly, always alert to the smallest sound. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand by the window, staring out at the dark street with a low, uneasy growl. It was as if he knew something was coming. That something arrived sooner than Mark expected. It was just after sunset on a Friday when Cooper began barking again. This time not from the window, but from the backyard. Mark stepped outside with his flashlight, expecting maybe a raccoon or stray cat. But as the beam swept across the grass, he froze. Someone had broken through the back gate. The lock was snapped clean off, the latch twisted. And there, near the edge of the yard, lay a black duffel bag, half open, soaked from the earlier rain. Mark knelt and unzipped it slowly. Inside were thick envelopes of documents, flash drives, and a folder labeled Willow Creek Financials, Private. He barely had time to process it when Cooper began growling again, this time facing the open gate. Mark turned just in time to see a shadow moving quickly along the fence line. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, disappearing into the alley beyond the houses. Mark shouted, giving chase, but the figure was gone before he reached the corner. All that remained was the duffel bag. Whoever had left it wanted him to find it, or wanted him to take the fall for having it. Inside his house, Mark Spar had the contents across the kitchen table: bank statements, receipts, emails between HOA members discussing fund reallocations, and at the bottom, a set of signed documents bearing Judith's husband's name. They referenced shell companies and contractor reimbursements that never existed. The HOA had been siphoning funds for years, hiding it under the guise of community maintenance. Mark's hands trembled as he realized the scale of it. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized theft, possibly criminal. And now, somehow, he had the proof. But before he could call the authorities, headlights flashed across his window. A car slowed in front of his house, idled for a few seconds, then drove off. Another followed not long after. Cooper barked furiously each time, his protective instincts in overdrive. Mark turned off the lights, his heart pounding. The message was clear. Someone knew he had the documents. The next morning, he reached out to the same local reporter who had covered Cooper's hero story. She agreed to meet at a cafe outside the neighborhood. Mark packed the documents carefully into a backpack and left early, keeping an eye on his mirrors as he drove. Cooper stayed behind, watching him go, tail wagging faintly. But when Mark returned 2 hours later, his house was different. The front door was slightly ajar. His gut dropped. He pushed it open slowly. The living room was untouched, but the back door hung open, swinging gently in the wind. Cooper was gone. Mark's stomach twisted. He called out, his voice cracking, but the silence was deafening. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, but Cooper had vanished without a trace. A cold, calculated warning. The police were called again, but their search turned up nothing. They offered theories: escaped during the break-in, spooked by intruders. But Mark knew better. This wasn't random. Someone had taken Cooper to send a message. That night, Mark sat in the darkened living room, the documents spread out before him, the empty leash lying on the floor beside the couch. For the first time, fear outweighed anger. But grief quickly hardened into resolve. They could take his peace, his security, even his dog, but they couldn't take the truth. He would find Cooper, and when he did, he would make sure everyone responsible for this, every board member, every accomplice, every shadow hiding behind HOA paperwork, paid for what they'd done. To be continued in Chapter 6, The Hero Returns. Chapter 6, The Hero Returns. The next 48 hours were the longest of Mark's life. The house felt lifeless without the rhythmic thump of Cooper's tail against the floor or the soft jingling of his collar. Every creak of the house made Mark tense. Every bark in the distance made him rush to the window, hoping, praying. But Cooper was gone. He didn't sleep much. Instead, he combed through the duffel bag's contents again and again, looking for clues, anything that might connect the documents to whoever had taken his dog. The more he read, the more tangled the web became. The files revealed a chain of illegal fund transfers, money laundered through fake maintenance companies tied to a single name: Daniel Pierce, Judith's husband. Mark realized what had happened. When Daniel's illegal operations were uncovered in the fire, the board had gone into damage control. Now that Mark had the evidence, Daniel, or whoever worked with him, was trying to silence him once and for all. Cooper's disappearance wasn't random. It was leverage. The local police offered little help. "Probably just a runaway dog," they said, handing him a stack of generic missing pet flyers. But Mark knew Cooper. He wouldn't have run. Not from him. So Mark took matters into his own hands. He started canvassing the area, posting flyers, talking to neighbors, checking every shelter and vet clinic within 20 miles. Some people avoided eye contact, too afraid to speak. Others quietly handed him bits of information, fragmented details. Then came the first real lead. A teenager from 2 blocks over approached him one evening, nervous but sincere. He'd seen a man matching Daniel Pierce's description driving toward the edge of town 2 nights ago with a dog in the back of his truck, a golden retriever, barking frantically. The road led toward an old industrial district, mostly abandoned, filled with empty warehouses and unused construction yards. Mark's pulse quickened. It was a dangerous place for anyone, let alone a stolen dog. But he didn't hesitate. The next morning, just before dawn, he drove out there, armed with nothing but a flashlight, his phone, and the determination that had been growing inside him for weeks. The area was desolate. Rusted fences leaned into cracked asphalt, graffiti sprawled across the walls. As he moved deeper into the district, a faint sound reached him. It was distant but unmistakable. A bark. Mark's heart leapt. He followed the sound through a narrow alley, pushing past a half-collapsed gate until he came upon a small, dilapidated storage building. The door was chained but loose enough to pry open. Inside, the smell of gasoline and old metal hung heavy in the air. And there, in the corner, chained to a support beam, was Cooper. The moment their eyes met, Cooper's tail started thumping against the floor. Relief flooded through Mark so intensely it nearly brought him to his knees. He rushed forward, unfastened the chain, and hugged the dog tightly. Cooper's fur was dirty, his paws scraped, but he was alive. That's when Mark noticed something else. Stacked boxes, sealed with black tape, identical to the ones Judith's husband had stored in the garage. Inside one, faint chemical smells still lingered. Another box held shredded documents and discarded HOA paperwork. Daniel had been hiding evidence here, waiting for the right time to destroy it. But he wasn't gone yet. As Mark turned to leave, he heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate. Daniel Pierce stepped into the doorway, rain dripping from his jacket, his expression cold. His eyes darted to the open box, then to Cooper, then to Mark. For a tense moment, neither moved. Then, without a word, Daniel lunged forward. Mark shoved the box aside, shouting for Cooper to run. The dog bolted out into the rain-soaked alley, barking loudly, drawing attention from the road. Mark followed, slipping in the mud as Daniel chased after them. Headlights flared suddenly at the end of the street, a police cruiser drawn by the commotion. Daniel froze, realization dawning too late. Mark shouted for help, pointing toward the building. Within minutes, officers swarmed the scene. Inside the warehouse, they found the remaining evidence, dozens of boxes of financial records, chemicals, and falsified HOA documents. It was enough to expose everything. Daniel was arrested that night. The investigation that followed tore through Willow Creek Estates like a storm. The entire HOA board was implicated. Carl, the treasurer, even one of the former secretaries. Years of corruption, extortion, and fraud unraveled under public scrutiny. The board was dissolved, and the homeowners voted to form a new association, one built on transparency rather than fear. As for Mark and Cooper, their story became local legend. The same news outlet that once covered their heroism returned again, this time with cameras rolling as Cooper sat proudly beside his owner, wagging his tail under the soft glow of a news crew's spotlight. The reporter asked what it felt like, knowing his dog had saved the neighborhood not once, but twice. Mark smiled faintly, his hand resting on Cooper's head. He didn't need to say much. The answer was written in the way Cooper leaned against him, calm and content, as if the chaos of the past weeks had never happened. In the months that followed, Willow Creek changed. The neighbors who once kept to themselves began to talk more, help each other, rebuild what fear had broken. The old HOA office was converted into a community center, its walls lined with photos from the night of the fire, one of which showed Cooper, covered in soot but standing tall, his eyes alert. Peace returned at last. Not the enforced quiet Judith once demanded, but a real peace, earned through struggle and courage. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the cicadas began their steady hum, Mark would sit on his porch, Cooper stretched out beside him. The fines were gone, the fear was gone, and the house finally felt like home again. Sometimes a passing neighbor would stop to scratch Cooper behind the ears or drop off a treat, calling him the hero of Willow Creek. Cooper always accepted it graciously, wagging his tail like the humble guardian he was. And though Mark never forgot what they'd endured, he knew one truth more than any other. The HOA had wanted his dog gone, but in the end, that dog had saved them all.